Well, I thought I'd start by saying what Kilkenny was like in 1324. So my title is Outlaws and In-Laws, the Complex World of Dame Alice Kyteler. It is because of the witchcraft trial of Alice Kyteler in 1324 that we learn just how fascinating Kilkenny was in the 1300s. There were two major participants in this trial, the secular Arnold de Puer, Seneschal of Kilkenny, and the clerical Richard Ledred, Bishop of Ossory. The reason we know about this event is most fortuitous and indeed unusual for Ireland, in that we have three surviving contemporary documents, Latin sources that tell the story and indeed the gossip. The most important is a 14th century manuscript in the British Library called A Contemporary Narrative of the Proceedings against Dame Alice Kyteler, prosecuted for sorcery in 1324 by Richard de Ledred, Bishop of Ossory. Well, the narrative is a legal document and it defends Bishop Ledred, making a particular point of justifying his legal position and focus attention on the jurisdictional conflicts that were associated with the case. It appears to have been composed very soon after the events, either by Ledred or by one of his adherents. But we must be aware that it is clearly biased. The narrative opens with the statement that Ledred discovered that in Kilkenny were sorceresses who were well versed in all kinds of heresies. He declared that his diocese was a hotbed of devil worshippers and instituted proceedings against Alice and her accomplices on 7 counts. However, the 6th charge is the most relevant to the history of Kilkenny. We are told that the sons and daughters of the said lady's 4 husbands were publicly appealing to the bishop, seeking remedy and assistance. They alleged she'd used sorceries of this kind to murder the fathers of some of them and to infatuate others, reducing their senses to such stupidity that they gave all their possessions to her and her own son, thus impoverishing forever the sons and heirs. Moreover, the lady's present husband, the knight Sir John Le Puer, had reached such a state through powders and through sorceries that his whole body was emaciated, his nails had fallen out, and all hair removed from his body. Well, the inescapable conclusion must be the 6th accusation, the accumulation of wealth by Alice, for and on behalf of her son William, and this was the initial motivation for her stepchildren to bring the accusation in 1324. Well, the second source, again local, very local indeed, is the 14th century Annals of the Franciscan friar John Clyn, down here in Kilkenny. Clyn was a Franciscan friar living in Kilkenny, and he was writing his famous Annals about 10 years later. Now, Clyn's Annals only report what he knows to be the truth. He's a very truthful chronicler. It might be expected that these annals would have some significant and extended comments about the very controversial Franciscan bishop of Ossory, Richard Ledred, but this is not the case. Clyn only mentions Ledred 3 times, 1318, 1324, and 1327. Ledred is never named by Clyn as a Franciscan, but then that might have seemed unnecessary. The limited information in the coverage of Ledred's confrontational episode in Ireland is both fascinating and informative, as Clyn, in effect, reveals more by what he omits than what he actually records. The first notice about Ledred is in 1318, with the report that he had been made Bishop of Ossory by Pope John XXII in Avignon. This was not a fortunate appointment, and there is evidence to prove that Ledred had begun to quarrel with and irritate the inhabitants of Kilkenny almost from his arrival in Dublin, in Ireland in 1317, and he very quickly started complaining to the Pope about the Kilkenny people. A letter from the Pope to the Justiciar of Ireland in 1320 lists the complaints. He'd been molested by royal officials, robbed, falsely accused, and 3 of his servants had been maltreated while acting on his behalf in Kilkenny. Well, the second mention of Ledred by Clyn was the simple statement that Alice Kyteler was tried, proven and condemned as a heretic by Friar Richard, Bishop of Ossory. Says nothing else. After Alice's maidservant, Petronilla de Medea, was burnt at the stake, Clyn, reporting this event, which, remember, was instigated by a fellow Franciscan, states that this was the first case of its kind and never been seen or heard of in Ireland, that anyone should suffer death for heresy, and he does not mention Ledred's part in her fate. Seemingly, the people of Kilkenny were astonished at the result of the trial. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the coverage of Ledred in these Kilkenny Franciscan Annals is that Clyn never reported that Ledred fled from Ireland in 1329 and was in exile in Avignon. Moreover, he did not even report the return of Ledred to Ireland in September 1347. Had he held any good opinion of Ledred, he would surely, at the very least, have entered into his annals Ledred's successful return to Kilkenny, to his diocese. The third contemporary document to record the trial is the 14th century Dublin Annals of Friar John de Pembridge, a Dominican prior writing in Dublin also in the 1330s. Pembridge has extra information about Kyteler not to be found in either Clyn or in Ledred's narrative. This, no doubt, is the result of rumours and exaggeration reaching Dublin, and Pembridge, unlike Clyn, is inclined to believe tall tales. Naturally, Pembridge, as a Dominican, is interested in the Kyteler case, but he is reporting it from a physical distance and from a year later, so he has a far more sensational twist to it than Clyn. His report may well have been imported even into his annals, as it is the only year in the whole of Pembridge's annals that has two 1325s. In other words, he could have just imported it. However, we must be aware that 2 Dominicans and 2 Franciscans were allowed to accompany Ledred to prison here in the castle, so those religious orders would have first-hand knowledge of the event. However, only in Pembridge report do we find the information that Alice put ointment on a stick called a coultree, which is, I looked it up in sort of French, and it's an agricultural instrument that's a bit like a scythe, which I think would have been most uncomfortable to cover with oil and go rushing around the world in, which you could then ride on throughout the world. And the statement, she would clean out the neighbourhood of Kilkenny and sweeping the filth all the way up to the house of William Outlaw, her son, and swearing an oath that all the prosperity of Kilkenny would come to him. If Ledred had this probably spurious information, then it would have been in his narrative, and he doesn't mention it. It is far more likely to be just an example of how quickly rumour can add to and distort the truth. Well, these 3 primary contemporary sources are most valuable for revealing the merchant class in Kilkenny as they were in the 1320s. These merchants and local magnates were very self-confident, independent, energetic, and extremely well assured. And included among their number was the extraordinary, strong, dominant woman, Alice Kyteler. Well, my first encounter with Alice Kyteler was when I was researching for my book on the Annals of Friar John Clyn of Kilkenny, and I very quickly became fascinated by her, as everyone does. She was a woman, and the history of women had barely been examined until fairly recently. Throughout history, men functioned in public life, while women were relegated to the private sphere. Women were destined to be mothers, housewives, and nuns, roles that were essentially domestic and private, not thought to be worth recounting. The 12th century Abbot Hugh of Flavigny listed a celestial hierarchy which went like this. At the top, Peter and Paul, next the other apostles, the saintly hermits, the perfect monks, good bishops, good laymen, and last at the bottom of the list, women. We're not surprised, I think, but for earthly hierarchy was described as consisted of 3 classes: those who work, the peasants, those who fight, the knights, and those who pray, the priests. This description does not include a specific reference to women, but Bishop Gilbert of Limerick, the 12th century very well-travelled papal legate, qualified that point when he observed that women marry and serve those who pray, work, and fight. But here in Kilkenny, Alice challenged the pattern on all counts. So it is no wonder that she fascinated me. Well, Ireland, as we know, was a land of two nations, but it's only the Anglo-Irish that are involved in this case in Kilkenny at this time. Well, the great Anglo-Irish magnates of medieval Ireland, such as the Butlers, the Desmonds, the de Clares and the de Burghs, all held, as we know, vast tracts of lands under the authority of the English crown. But these great lords and magnates were often either absent in England, Scotland or France, and furthermore, sometimes there was a minority, with all the dangers attached to that volatile situation. In the case of South East Ireland, and particularly Kilkenny, the death of Gilbert de Clare at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 led to a minority. And while there was a minority, the king took charge of the estate. As the liberty of Kilkenny was part of the de Clare inheritance, the king was in effect in charge here in Kilkenny. Ireland was also then suffering from the effects of the Bruce invasion and a terrible famine. And remember, if the Bruce invasion had succeeded, then the King of England, who they all got their lands from, would not be their lord, and they could lose all their lands. It was a very fraught time. In 1316, during the Bruce invasion, we are told that when Bruce came to Skerries near Ardscull in Leinster, that it was Edmund le Butler, Justiciar of Ireland, Lord John Fitzthomas and Lord Arnold le Poer, and other magnates of Leinster and Munster who fought him. Also, John and Arnold le Poer, with John Fitzthomas, Richard de Clare, met with the king's representative, John the Hobbin, to discuss the very dangerous situation in Ireland. And it was at this time, in 1316, that the king gave Arnold le Poer extra lands. So Arnold was in effect an important and brave local man. The Le Poers held Kells, and Arnold was also the king's minister and a prime mover in the Kyteler affair. So the Le Poers were a very important local family. An uncle of Arnold was Mylor le Poer, who had just been consecrated as Bishop of Lechlin in County Carlow in 1321. And the Le Poers were very well respected by the Dominicans as great benefactors. And even Friar John Clyn reports the Le Poers as being on the side of law and order, fighting the Irish, holding the highest position of Seneschal of Kilkenny and Carlow, brave people. In 1321, Clyn tells us that just before Christmas, that Arnold le Poer, Seneschal of Kilkenny, maintained a great ward at Inistioge against the Roaches, and he bravely compelled them to give hostages to keep holding peace. Clyn praised the Le Poers. So even when Arnold le Poer was heavily involved in the Kyteler affair in 1324, Clyn did not accuse him. In Dublin, the Le Poers were also held in high regard. In fact, we are told by John de Pembridge, prior of the Dublin Dominicans, that the first stone of the choir of the friars preachers was laid by Lord Eustace le Poer on Friday, 5th of February in 1305, a very solemn affair. Also, Pembridge reports Eustace's death in 1311. And when Pembridge reports the death of Arnold le Poer eventually in 1329, he says, in Lent, the said Lord Arnold died in Dublin Castle and lay for a long time with the preachers without burial, with the Dominicans, in other words. They were loyal to the Le Poers and were willing to take his body and hold it even though he was in disgrace. Le Poer was left unburied in accordance with the 15th article of the Constitutions of Bishop Ledred, which declared that anyone who impedes the jurisdiction of the bishop shall not receive ecclesiastical burial, and if buried in ignorance, they would be exhumed and cast on a dunghill. Whether or not Pembridge believed the Kyteler accusation is arguable, what is important is that he demonstrates support for both Le Poer and Roger Outlaw. So Arnold le Poer is the local magnate and hero to the Anglo-Irish people of Kilkenny, the most important local man, the king's local representative, the man who is in charge of the civil life of the area. Now, the man in charge of the spiritual life was the papal appointee to the See of Ossory, the English note Franciscan Bishop Richard Ledred. The previous Bishop of Ossory was William Fitzjohn, who, as Clyn reports, had been promoted to the Archbishopric of Cashel. Fitzjohn had held variously the position of Deputy Justiciar and Chancellor of Ireland. In effect, he was a civil servant as well as a cleric. The newly arrived Bishop Richard Ledred, an English Franciscan, had been appointed as Bishop of Ossory by the Pope in Avignon, and he was a very different type of cleric. Now Ledred, an English Franciscan, arrived in Ireland to an area he did not know, to an area that was not accustomed to a reforming bishop. And interestingly, at the same time, the Pope had also appointed Alexander Bicknor to the Archbishopric of Dublin, in effect his superior. They may well have known each other in Avignon, but whether they did or did not, it's quite clear that Bicknor and Ledred were not compatible at all. It was to Ledred's advantage that during the early 1320s, when period we are talking about, de Bicknor was actively engaged in diplomacy on several missions to France. In 1323, he was in France in an embassy. In 1324, he was engaged in negotiating peace with France and also in arranging a Spanish match for Edward, Prince of Wales. So during the vital year, Bicknor was either in England or France. We assume that Bicknor did not like Ledred because later he successfully persecuted Ledred, and Bicknor was the reason why Ledred was forced into exile, during which period Bicknor, as Metropolitan, made a series of annual visitations to the Diocese of Ossory, which Clyn informs us had not been attempted since the 13th century. So in 1324, during this vital year, the Bicknor was either in England or France, and two important leaders were the king's Seneschal Arnold de Puer and the Bishop of Ossory, and each thought that they ruled Kilkenny. So now we have two different men, very different, on opposing sides, each assuming they have the full authority in the area. They went head to head with the Kyteler case when the Kyteler case erupted. The Kyteler case reveals a very independent spirit of the merchant and ruling class of Kilkenny. In Kilkenny at this period was a very wealthy and prosperous town, and of course still today we have the Liber Primus Kilkenniensis, which copies of the laws and regulations of the cities, and these records illustrate the interests of merchants such as the Kytlers and the outlaws. And the father of Alice Kyteler would no doubt have enjoyed a position of considerable wealth and influence within the upper levels of that urban society. As far as we can determine from contemporary sources, the Kytlers were Flemish merchants who had settled in Kilkenny sometime during the mid-13th century. The first recorded mention of the name is in 1277. William le Kyteler of Ypres, an important merchant with friends in high places, we are told, that although the king had prohibited merchants of Flanders from exporting wool, etc., from Kilkenny, he was allowed to do so. We also hear of a Robert le Kyteler dealing with Flemish merchants in 1295. So the father of Alice would no doubt have enjoyed a position of considerable wealth and influence within the upper levels of Kilkenny urban society. Well, it has long been accepted that merchants were educated, at the very least, sufficiently to check their accounts and read correspondence from other traders. Makes perfect sense. And evidence of writing pertaining to merchants, both male and female, abound in the administrative documents of the period. So as a daughter of a wealthy merchant, Alice was probably both literate and numerate. And in common with some daughters, she would most likely have helped her father in his business from an early age. With accumulation of family wealth and economic influence, it became practical and indeed feasible for women to help the family business. However, a daughter would still be expected to marry, and as Alice could inherit property from her father, that alone would have made her a very attractive matrimonial prize. And recent research has suggested 17 was the most common age for daughters of merchants to marry. Well, her first husband that we know about, and I will stress this, was the outlaw family. There may in fact have been an earlier one, as the accusations against Alice was brought by, we are told, the sons and daughters of the said lady's 4 husbands. And that clearly did not include her son, William Outlaw, because he wasn't bringing an action against Alice, his mother. So it may be that she had a 5th husband that isn't mentioned. At some time, around 1280, she married William Outlaw's father. The Outlaw family were also well-known and prosperous Kilkenny family. The most important man of that name in Ireland in these years was Roger Outlaw, prior of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem in Kilmainham, Dublin, and most importantly, Roger Outlaw was Chancellor of Ireland from 1322 until his death in 1340. What relation he was to William is impossible to determine. All that we know is that he's described as consanguineous, a blood relative in the narrative. When the 14th century author of the narrative is describing the Bishop of Lechlin as Arnold's uncle, he uses the correct Latin terminology of unculus. So it doesn't seem as if Roger was William's uncle, but he was a blood relative. Well, after her marriage, Alice probably participated in her outlaw's husband's business dealings. And by looking at Alice's son, William Outlaw, we can begin to extrapolate her age. William was sufficiently mature to be elected as sovereign, as it was called then, in other words, what we call mayor now today, of Kilkenny in 1305. And also, according to the Liber Primus Kilkenniensis, a Henry Outlaw was also sovereign mayor of Kilkenny in 1312. It's unlikely that William would achieve such an office before his early 20s. Therefore, Alice must have been married 1280, and therefore she was probably born around 1260. It's quite clear that after the death of her outlaw husband, she continued to be involved with the financial life in Kilkenny in partnership with her son William, with whom she had great trust. As a daughter of a wealthy father, a widow of a wealthy merchant husband, she would no doubt have a considerable fortune and be free to marry or remain single if she wished. But in a male-dominated society, a husband was useful. After the death of her outlaw husband, Alice, as his widow, was entitled to her dower. This was the entitlement of the widow to the use of 1/3 of the property her husband held on the day of his death. And this was enshrined in Magna Carta. It was written in stone, in other words. By 1303, when her son William was declared an adult, she was already married, as we know, to Adam le Blond of Clyn. We estimate she would be around 40 years of age in 1303. And with her new husband, she's named in documents. But these business transactions aroused strong feelings in Kilkenny circles, as a very interesting item of evidence from 1302 to 1303 indicates. In it, we find that William Outlaw had complained to King Edward I, and this shows the links, the power of links and influence, saying that William le Kyteler, another le Kyteler, Sheriff of the Liberty of Kilkenny, and Fulk de la Frain, Seneschal of Kilkenny, had forced an entry into William's house at night and dug up £3,000 from the floorboards and took it away, which money, William said, had been given to him by Adam le Blond of Clyn and his wife Alice for safekeeping. They also took another £100 of William's personal money as well. When we remember a day's wages for a labourer was a penny to a penny halfpenny, you're talking here about £3,000 plus £100. You're talking an awful lot of money. This sum indicates clearly both the wealth of Alice's family and the measure of the high level of medieval trade in Kilkenny. What is fascinating is in that same year, King Edward I acknowledged that he owed the sum of £500 to Adam le Blond and Alice, his wife, for a loan in helping him with the Scottish wars. So here we have Alice and Kilkenny and Adam le Blond, and they're lending the King in England money for his Scottish wars. It's clear that Alice's sphere of influence extended well beyond Kilkenny, and is an indication of the importance of Alice. So the king now determined that his own officer, the Sheriff of Dublin, should investigate that complaint, and it is in the king's letter to his Sheriff of Dublin that we learn the additional information that William le Kyteler, in order, we are told, to be able to keep the money he'd dug up in William's house, had levelled malicious charges of homicide and other crimes against Adam, Alice and Rose Outlaw, all of whom had been imprisoned and were threatened with execution. The king now demanded that his sheriff in Dublin should place Fulk and William on bail to appeal before the justiciar and order the release of Adam, Alice and Rose. Now, what a relationship there was between Rose and Alice Kyteler is not given. If she'd been a daughter, the narrative would have said so. And so it's possible that she was just one of her relatives who was living in the house with her or something. Because it was quite often that young girls would just live in a relative's house until they were married. Whatever the cause of that contretemps within the family name, in 1302, it was settled by 1305, because now we find that William le Kyteler and Adam le Blonde acting together when they were accused of forestalling to the damage of £100. Forestalling is when they went out to the fields and they bought the crops before the king's justiciar could buy them, and they upped the price, sort of lovely financial thing. But now the plot begins to thicken, because 4 years later we find that Adam's husband had quitclaimed, that is to say, handed over to his stepson William all of his goods, chattels, jewels, etc. to William, and furthermore had cancelled any debts owed to him by William. As Adam le Blonde had children of his own, we can now begin to understand why the accusations were brought. 2 years later, perhaps age 45, she'd already married her third husband, Richard de Valais, a wealthy Tipperary landowner, and again William was benefiting. He was granted a debt of 200 marks. A mark was 2/3 of a pound, 13 shillings and fourpence, owed to Alice and Richard, and William was also granted power of attorney to collect a debt of £200 owed to them by the Earl of Ulster, the most powerful man in Ireland. Sometime before 1316, he also died, Richard de Valais, because now she's taking legal action against her stepson, Richard de Valais Jr., who is withholding her widow's dower. Richard de Valais died with 6 manors, so her section was a third, two manors, and she should have had that. The dowers, was entitlement, and you couldn't go against it. By now, at the very least, say age 52, Alice's wealth included 1/3 of the outlaw estate, 1/3 of Adam le Blonde's estate, and she was now suing for 1/3 of Richard de Valais' estate. In addition to her dower rights, she also had amassed this fantastic amount of money from her own financial activities. So when 1324 came, at the age of around 60, she was accused of witchcraft. She had acquired a 4th husband, the knight Sir John le Poer, whom she was accused of attempting to poison by magical potions. There are 2 possibilities. He could either be John le Poer of Dunhill or John le Poer, brother of Arnold. And Kieran Parker, who really looked into the le Poer family in this period, favours him being the brother of Arnold. A description of John in 1324 does give rise to some suspicion there may indeed have been some valid reason. He's described, remember, as emaciated, his nails torn out and all hair removed from his body. There are several minerals and some vegetable poisons available in the Middle Ages: powdered gold, arsenic, thallium, selenium, and they would all account for his appearance. I did actually pick up the phone from my office in Trinity, rang the Beaumont Hospital, and without explaining who I was, saying, if you saw a man with this, just looking like this, what poison could it this? There was this deathly hush. And they said, we'll get back to you. Can you give me? And I said, oh, I'm Dr. Bernadette Williams in Trinity. Then the next thing, Trinity switchboard came on to me and said, what have you been doing? We've got the Beaumont Hospital. I'd forgotten to say who I was. I was just working on it. And, you just pick up the phone, you say it. So anyway, any of these could have been responsible for what he looked like. There is also a hint in the documents that Alice, aged 60, may perhaps have been contemplating a 5th or indeed 6th husband. And this is a timely reminder that medieval lifespan, if you had money, was not always short. Now, witchcraft, sorcery, or maleficium, as is called in the documents, was a very commonplace accusation and usually treated by English law as a petty criminal offence, which was allocated to the bishop's court, where it was usually dealt with by an archdeacon as a petty offence. But Ledred saw it as apostasy, devil worship, and the accused were now charged with similar things to the Templars. Denial of Christ, nocturnal meetings, etc., etc. Now the legal case began. The first action was that Bishop Ledred wrote to the King's Chancellor of Ireland, Roger Outlaw, an outlaw, seeking a writ under which the sheriff could imprison the accused. Now remember, Roger was the King's Chancellor, was William's blood relative. William learned about the letter, and we are told he went around all the royal officials and the other nobles using his ill-gotten gains to win their friendship. In other words, Ledred was accusing him of bribing all the officials. These people included the Seneschal of Kilkenny, of course, Arnold le Puer. Now, both Roger Outlaw and Arnold now wrote to the bishop, telling him to abandon the case or adjourn it indefinitely. And Ledred refused point blank. The Chancellor, Roger Outlaw, then refused Ledred's request on legal grounds, saying he would not issue the necessary legal warrant until a public prosecution had been held, the witches had been excommunicated, and 40 days had elapsed. Receiving no satisfaction from Roger Outlaw, Ledred summoned Alice, who was now living in William Outlaw's house, to appear before him. She left Kilkenny before the summons could reach her, and evidently proceeded directly to Dublin, where she enlisted the help of Roger Outlaw. Outlaw now sent advocates to Kilkenny here to speak on her behalf. And this time, Ledred followed the legal proceedings down to the last detail and excommunicated Alice. Thwarted in his attempt to arrest Alice, Ledred now charged William Outlaw with heresy and harbouring and protecting heretics. Now the Seneschal, Arnold le Puer, and William Outlaw went to the bishop, and we are told that Arnold pleaded most passionately for the case to be dropped, but to no avail. The meeting ended with abuse and threats. Well, the next step in this extraordinary affair was the arrest of the bishop by Arnold le Puer's men. The narrative gives in considerable detail an account followed by the sergeant, Stephen le Puer. The bishop was shown the legal warrant for his arrest and informed that if he resisted, they had orders to raise a hue and cry against him with the horns hung round their neck for this very purpose. Ledred, however, had no intention of resisting arrest, but being very astute, read the documents publicly in front of everyone and then showed the seal on the warrant to the people around him and asked if they recognised the seal of Arnold on the warrant. Everybody did. Then Stephen wanted the warrant back as proof of his authority to arrest Ledred, but Ledred said no, and he then put the warrant in his pocket, saying he would keep it as evidence of his obedience, and he subsequently used it very successfully in court in Dublin against Arnold. Ledred also made certain the arrest was legal by instructing the sheriff to lay his hands on him or on the horse's bridle as required by law. So Ledred was well up to understanding the whole legal situation. Ledred also refused the sheriff's suggestion that he should seek the equivalent of bail, because that would be an admission that Arnold le Puer was entitled to arrest him, so he wouldn't appeal for bail. The purpose of arresting Ledred was to keep him in prison until the day had passed when William was supposed to appear before him. Arnold le Puer now embarked on a very dangerous enterprise. Now, but what is of interest is that Clyn, here in Kilkenny, just down the road here, Smethwick's down the road here, does not mention that Arnold le Puer, Seneschal of the Liberty of Kilkenny, arrested and imprisoned Bishop Ledred in Kilkenny Castle for 17 days. No mention of it in Clyn at all. Ledred's response was to place an interdict on the diocese. Now, this is very serious action. No baptisms, no marriages, no burials. I think the burials would affect people more than the marriages, and you could hold off the marriages and the baptisms could last. But if your husband had died, your child had died, your wife had died, and you couldn't have a Christian burial, that would affect you. And when an absolute belief in the existence of hell and hellfire existed, as it certainly did in the Middle Ages, then such an interdict was most grave. But again, Clyn doesn't mention it. He is silent. It is the narrative that gives the thrilling account, and when I say thrilling, I also mean probably biased. It also relates that Ledred requested the host to be brought to him in prison. So therefore, when the host is brought to him here in Kilkenny Castle, Christ is being imprisoned. Now, you're getting very serious now. So now we have a scene of a procession going through the centre of Kilkenny, headed by the dean and the chapter from the cathedral, then all the clergy and people and townspeople, and now in effect, in the form of the host, Christ was imprisoned. And the narrative says everybody came out to see it, and it implies that they all were in favour of Ledred. But let's be honest, it's such a dramatic scene, everybody would come out in this main street up and down to see what was happening. Now comes to me what is for me one of the most fascinating bits of it. William, hoping to find evidence against the bishop, went to the archives of the Chancery of the Liberty of Kilkenny and found there an old accusation against the bishop, which, unfortunately, from William's point of view, had been cancelled. It's interesting to note that we are told that William examined the document with his own eyes, thus proving William could read. Not to be defeated, William had it written out again, and then I love this bit, and he then rubbed it on the writing with his shoes to age it, with his dirty shoes, with the soles of his shoes, before presenting it to Arnold Le, who then attempted to force the bishop to answer the charges on it. Bishop refused on the legal grounds he could only answer on temporal matters before the King of England, and moreover he was not bound to answer charges before men who had been excommunicated. Well, when the day arranged for William's day in court had passed, the bishop was then released from prison. But when they unlocked the door here, where we are, I presume, the bishop refused to exit, saying that it would not do for a bishop imprisoned for his faith in Christ to walk out as if he was a thief or a murderer. He then ordered his episcopal vestments to be brought down from St. Canice's, and then with great solemnity he led the way in procession again through the centre of the town to his cathedral church. Well, I mean, I would love to have been around then. High drama was not in it. Ledred once again cited William and Alice to appear before him, but a sergeant arrived from the Chancellor with the royal writ requiring the bishop to go up to Dublin before the Justiciar of Ireland and explain why he had placed his diocese under an interdict and to answer complaints made by Lord Arnold Le against him, and failure to appear was liable to a fine of £1,000. The influence of Alice, again evident now, it's quite clear she'd gone to the Dublin not to hide, but the reverse was the case. She was up in Dublin, and Ledred was incensed to report that the said lady, sorceress, heretic and magician, was freely allowed to consort in the town with her comrades, often in the company of William Douceman and many other clerics and lawmen, and we are told that she was usually placed with the great men and leaders of the land in public assemblies. The William Douceman referred to must be William Douce, a very important man in Dublin circles at the time. He was a merchant who was also doing business here in Kilkenny as early as 1306, when he was trading with William Outlaw, as they are both witnesses to the same deed in Christchurch in 1322. And according to the memoranda rolls, William Outlaw also acted as William Douce's attorney. Now, Phil Connolly and myself we definitely think she had her eye on him as the next husband. He was mayor of Dublin from September 1322 to 24, so Alice was often in the company of the mayor of Dublin. It is surely a measure of her power and wealth that while under investigation for witchcraft and suspected homicide, she was treated so preferentially. There can be no doubt she was doing her best to influence the case, and that perhaps there was some truth what Ledred said. He said he couldn't go up to Dublin because he'd have to cross Arnold Le lands and he would be in danger if he did. His excuse was not accepted and the case was now getting more heated. The next confrontation occurred in Kilkenny when the seneschal court was sitting. Ledred now sent 2 monks, plus the head of the Dominicans and the head of the Franciscans, to request permission to address the court to plead for the arrest of the heretics. Now, this proves that Clyn and Pembridge would both have known about the affair. Arnold responded, saying the bishop would enter the seneschal's course at his own peril. Now we see the theatrical bishop in action again. Ledred's response was to arrive at the seneschal's court, dressed in full pontifical clothes and carrying a copy of the decretals concerning heretics. He also carried the host in a decorated gilt vessel, we are told, and with lighted candles accompanied by the Dominicans and the Franciscans, his own chapter and clerics tried to enter the court. but several noblemen blocked his way. Arnold now got very annoyed, and he called the bishop an ignorant, low-born vagabond from England with a lump of dough in his hand. I mean, those are really strong words. Ledred now compared the situation with Christ standing before Pontius Pilate. As an aside, when Ledred held up the copy of the decretals, he said, "As a knight, you may know how to read a bit." This is what he said to Arnold. "But just in case, we are ready to read them out to you." And here we are told that he told Arnold he would read them out in both English and French, proving the French was being spoken in Kilkenny as well at this time. And then Arnold was not intimidated, and he said, "Take your decretals to church and preach your sermons there." The prayer attempted to have Ledred forcibly removed, but the bishop was carrying the host. So the assault was now not only upon Ledred, but upon the body of Christ. So you can see the whole drama of this. Then Alice, through her lawyers, retaliated, and she accused Ledred of defamation of character, no summons or conviction, she'd been excommunicated, and she appealed and said she'd been suffering a grave injustice. And the bishop was summoned to appear before the court in Dublin. When he did reach Dublin, he found that everybody was aligned against him. Evidently, Alice had her considerable network of influential people. The only person at this stage willing to support Ledred was William de Nottingham, whose father had been mayor of Dublin just before William Doosman was mayor of Dublin. So it could have been just, a rivalry. It was agreed that 4 bishops would hear the case, and it's now that the imprisonment of the bishop can see to have been a big mistake. They both argued their cases, and from the standpoint of the history of Anglo-Irish of medieval Ireland, to me, the most important aspect of the court is the words Arnold Le Poer used to appeal for solidarity from his fellow Anglo-Irish against the Englishman, Bishop Ledred. He said, "As you well know, heretics have never been found in Ireland, which has always been called the Island of Saints. Now this foreigner comes from England and says we are all heretics and excommunicants. Defamation of this country affects every one of us, so we must all unite against this man." Well, it was inevitable that the case would go in Ledred's favour. In the end of the day, you can't, certainly at that time, you couldn't go against the church. He was now allowed to seek the arrest of Alice, but Alice, seeing the way the wind was blowing, had already fled from the city of Dublin. In the narrative, it more or less says that the authorities allowed the mother of William Outlaw to make her escape quite openly. She may have returned to Kilkenny, and that would make perfect sense because here she would have gold and money. But anyway, there's no further record of Alice in contemporary documents. Where did she go after leaving Kilkenny? It's more than possible that she set her sight on Flanders. After all, the Kytlers were Flemish, and as merchants, the Kytlers probably still maintained a degree of mercantile connections there. If she had indeed set off for Flanders, it might explain a most odd legend which surfaced in the West Riding of Yorkshire. The legend concerns a witch named Dame Alice Kyteler, who, using witchcraft, helped her foster son, the owner of Clapdale Castle, in 1467, during the period of the War of the Roses, and the similarity between the two women are very apparent. Both witches' familiars were called Robin Artisan. However, this Alice was not hated by the people, but was good. And she was taken by the victorious soldiers to the good Irish Bishop of Offaly, who was then making a visitation in Lancaster. And anyway, she was required to cover the church with lead. The similarities are striking, and it's tempting to envisage Alice with her entourage boarding a boat from Dublin to perhaps Fleetwood or Furness, which was routes that were taken a lot in this period, and en route for Flanders, and perhaps dying in or near Clapdale. Her death would end the need to conceal her identity. We don't know. I'd like to think that she moved on and just went on, certainly, to Ypres or to Flanders. Well, though, just to finish quickly, although deprived of Alice Kyteler, Ledred pursued his case against William. And in Kilkenny, and all the Dublin officials came down. The Justiciar, the Chancellor, the Treasurer were in Kilkenny to follow the case. Now, the next enthralling happening tells us that while they were in here in Kilkenny, the Dublin officials enjoyed the hospitality of William Outlaw's house, where they held banquets, no less, to which one assumes Ledred was not invited, as he complained that the favour they were bestowing on William was a scandal. As an action that further exacerbated Ledred was that the Chancellor, Roger Outlaw, moved himself from the Franciscan friary, Smethwick's there, where all three had been housed, and they moved to William Outlaw's house, despite the fact that they'd never before stayed there when they'd been in the city. Well, it was inevitable, and we all know the end of it. William was forced to apologise. He was forced to go on bended knees. He was imprisoned here for a while in Kilkenny Castle, and his second set of penances was that he had to hear Mass 3 times a day, and he had to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But you could pay for someone to go. You could say, I'm sick, and then, hand over the money and say he's going in my place. And he did roof St. Canice's. So Ledred was still furious because he heard that William was enjoying a great time and was having feasts in his house while he was supposed to be doing all this penance. He was victorious, but the repercussions of this case reverberated for many decades. Arnold Lapoire was imprisoned in Dublin Castle and died there before the negotiations to secure his release. 5 years later, in 1329, Ledred was driven into exile from Ireland, and 3 years later, in 1332, the weight of William Outlaw's lead caused the roof of St. Canice's to fall in. Well, just to conclude, the case of Alice is a great gift through Irish historians on several counts. We see the woman Alice as a strong, powerful, and totally awesome woman. She might have been murdering her husbands. We really don't know, but I think there's a little bit of suspicion about her there. We see the very independent spirit of the merchant and ruling classes of Kilkenny. They were not going to allow an Englishman or somebody that the Pope had sent over from Avignon to come in here to Kilkenny and start bossing them all around. We learned that the Anglo-Irish, or as Clyn called them, the English living in the land of Ireland, considered themselves now as allied to Ireland. And we learn about the law as it was used, as it was understood, and as it was manipulated. Alice Kyteler was born of a merchant family and evidently imbued with an entrepreneurial spirit, and this was witnessed time and time again in her business dealings. Whether in the last analysis it can be said she murdered some of her husbands, we shall never know. But the end result was that, as usual, sadly, the wealthy Adam and William escaped full retribution, and the maidservant Petronilla was the scapegoat. Thank you.